I'd like to bring forward our first presenter for today, Neil Bendle.
Okay, well, thanks very much, and thanks for being on the call, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and great to talk to you all. Today, I'm going to be talking about sustainable marketing accountability, and we kind of sort of want to sort of frame it as a sort of a business issue. So, we'll be talking a lot about sort of the business of how marketing can be sustainable. Um, so our new white paper is something. Please do check it out after this presentation if you haven't already. And I just firstly, before we get into anything else, just say what a great team we have. So if you can kind of look at the names there's Sarah and there's Alfred and Frank and Johanna, all invaluable experts on the topic. And I think we've put together a good piece of work. Eric has been vital to sort of putting it together, making sure that the work was done properly. And Cristiano, thank you for the design that you'll see later. So exciting paper, I think. So please, do check it out. So what else can we say? Oh, I probably should say who I am too. So I'm Neil Bendle, and I'm Professor of Marketing here at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. And so I teach a lot on sustainable marketing, sustainable business. I blog a lot on it as well. I'll give you my website at the end for those of you who are looking for extra reading material. Sustainable marketing accountability is building on MASB work. So we've already in the Universal Marketing Dictionary got some definitions of sustainable marketing. And there was a bunch of stuff we tried to sort of get over when we were talking about that. But over the next sort of few minutes, I'll be talking about what actually is sustainable marketing. And I think this is one of the problems people have. We get into a lot of discussions where people aren't necessarily meaning the same thing. And it's obviously very hard to have a discussion where you're talking across each other rather than for. This is kind of the MASB definition that we've got up there. Sustainable marketing aims to recognize and address negative environmental and societal externalities. I'm sure everyone knows what an externality is, at the risk of going back to earlier econ classes. But this idea that so what we do, impacts people who aren't involved in that decision. And so one of the things we want to emphasize is that we can enhance the positive environmental, the social development, the societal benefits of this production, distribution, promotion, packaging, and pricing of the offerings. So it's kind of a very wide idea, and it's something that's really important. I think it's about making the world better at the same time as making a successful business. It encompasses systems and strategies. So one thing it's much broader than is purely communications. It's not just making a green claim, putting it on your packaging, and you're good to go. It's much bigger than that, much wider than that, and it often attempts to influence consumers and others towards more sustainable behaviors. We'll talk about how this can actually be profitable. If we think about how broad it is, there's going to be actually quite a lot of ways that it can be profitable to be sustainable. Probably the core definition is from a 1987 UN report. And that's, this is kind of the informal definition, but to be honest, I think it's a very good one. Meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's the definition of sustainability. That's kind of what we want to get to as a world. And think about this, it's just important to leave the world in a decent state. But one of the things I think it's really important to emphasize, and I think lots of people kind of miss this, is it does also involve meeting the needs of the present now. So this isn't just, we're going to sacrifice now for future generations. We actually have to achieve things now. We have reasonable needs and desires that we need to satisfy. And there's a whole ton of people in the world who, are in probably much more difficult circumstances than anyone on this call, who have massive needs that need to be fulfilled. So a system where we all just like not to do much isn't gonna cut it as sustainable. So that's not sustainable. So it's important to think that this isn't some sort of very narrow idea. It's a very broad idea, and it needs to bring in the future, but also the present. Being good in the present. Helping us meet our needs. Kind of implied by that is it isn't just about being green. So a lot of people hear sustainability and they think environmental. And environmental is a crucial part of that. If we destroy the planet, then it's clearly not sustainable. Um, but this idea that we also need to meet the needs of the present means that we need to make a societal contribution. And sort of when we're talking getting onto sort of the idea of sustainable business now, but it needs to be commercially successful too. Sustainability isn't just about, or certainly isn't about, giving away something for a short term and then finding out you can't do it anymore because you've run out of money. That's not sustainable by its nature. It's kind of you can hear that in the definition there. So when we talk about sustainability, we do mean being good for the environment, but we also mean positive social contribution, and we also mean long-term commercial success. We mean that the company needs to be an economic success, the country needs to be an economic success, the world needs to be economically successful to be truly sustainable. One of the things that's vital to understand is just how important marketing's role in this is. So a lot of times people might think, hey, that's nice, but what's it got to do with me? Well, if you kind of think how broad sustainability is, that kind of means that it touches most of what we do. You can make a pretty strong case for marketing being involved in all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, there's a whole bunch of things we can get involved in and how we can make things better. I mean, clearly things like, affordable energy is a fairly obvious one, but even things like gender equality, quality education, these are all things that marketers can have a role in. If we were going to pick on, what are the core sort of business SDGs, probably SDG 8 is a pretty good place to start. Decent work and economic growth. So this, again, I want to emphasize, it's not about us, just giving up things for a brighter future. We want economic growth, we want decent work, we want people to have good qualities of life now. We want them to have them later as well, but we want them to have them now as well. And so we need that decent work. We need that economic growth. And that's why it's in there in SDG 12. So sustainability is absolutely connected to business. It's not anti-business. It certainly isn't anti-marketing. And so marketing has this key role across the SDGs. Marketers work on innovation, they work on health, they work on education, they work on water access, they work on clean energy, they work on equality, they work on preserving the natural world. And so one of the things ISO does, the International Standards Organization, who MASB has been working closely with on things like brand standards, brand valuation, brand evaluation standards, amongst other things. One of the things that ISO does is tie everything they do to these UN SDGs. And as I say, you could very easily tie to most of these SDGs, if not them all. But certainly, if I was to pick the marketer's SDG, if that makes sense, the one thing that, fits purely and sort of very, very clearly in our camp, and that's responsible consumption and production. This could have been written for us, to be honest. It very much is what we see, marketers being involved in. How do we get a world where people are consuming and are producing, but they're producing and consuming in a responsible manner. And throughout this discussion today, we'll be giving examples of how businesses can sort of help, in their own way, tackle some sort of problem in the world. Now, first, it's worth saying that I'm a huge movie person, so I could have just done 40 minutes on sort of movies related to sustainable marketing, but I promised I wouldn't do that. But if we can, so you can see that It's a Wonderful Life reference at the bottom, we'll get to that. But it's important when thinking about sustainable marketing and making it a reality. A couple of things. Firstly, we're not going to be perfect. And I think that's something that people kind of sometimes struggle with. Better is better. It's not perfect. And I think that's as we work, don't sort of worry about being perfect. As long as you're improving, as long as you're getting better, as long as we're in the right direction, we're getting in the right direction at a decent speed, that's good. That's what we can do. No marketer on their own is going to make the world perfect, and there's no reason to sort of beat yourself up about not doing that. But you can aim to make the world a better place, and many marketers do. And so this is the aim to do well by doing good. Getting back to the idea of commercial success, there's nothing. If you can make money while making the world a better place, that's fantastic. That's actually what we really want to do. We want economic growth. We want, people to have opportunities, but we also want, the world to be a better place, the environment to be a better place, socially a better place as well. So this links back to this idea of the triple bottom line. And when you hear the triple bottom line, it's economic, social, and environmental impacts. That's kind of a nice way of thinking about it. These things tend to overlap. And so it's, like any categorization, it's maybe, you have to sort of simplify a tiny bit. There's a lot of social and environmental impacts that kind of come together. But broadly speaking, this is the three things you should be thinking about in sustainable marketing. What's our economic impact? Are we commercially successful? Are we actually, managing to make something that people want to buy? What's our social impact? Are we having a good impression on the communities we live with, the people we work with? And what's the environmental impact? Are we, making hopefully a positive, but certainly not a negative impact on the environment? Sometimes the triple bottom line is described as the three Ps: people, planet, and profit. It's kind of a bit of a simplification, but as marketers, I think we will appreciate it because it's got a nice acronym of three Ps. People, planet, and profit is kind of an easy way of thinking about that: economic, social, environmental. Frank.
Hi, Neil. So we have our first question in our from the attendees. Scott asked, as a marketer, how would I best address sustainable marketing if the target customers of my company clearly don't have a preference or a need for the traditional goals of sustainable marketing?
So a lot of the benefits of, I don't know what particular company is. We'd have to know a bit more details there. But when I talk about the sort of the benefits of sustainable business more broadly, to be honest, um, it's important to think of them as quite widely. Now, I think, you know, do the consumers need some of the ideas of sustainable marketing? Maybe they're willing to pay a bit more for it, maybe they're not. And if they are, that's fantastic, obviously. If they're not, that makes it a bit more challenging. But they may actually last longer with you. One of the things as well that's a pure sort of marketing idea is these idea of strategic partnerships I talk about a lot. So we can kind of talk about ideas of like who you're going to be working with. Um, so if you're working with a company that cares, like if you're a B2B firm and you work with a company that cares about sustainability, then one of your sort of core differentiators could be the fact that you're more sustainable. So even if the end consumer doesn't necessarily care as much, the middle consumer could. This is particularly going to be more and more important over the next few years, with more reporting coming in. So obviously in the EU, if people have been following that, there's a lot of reporting requirements coming in about, say, greenhouse gas emissions. And this is coming in California too. It may come in New York. Um, you know, if you behave in a sustainable manner, in this case, like if you lower your greenhouse gas emissions, that makes you a more appealing partner. And so you can kind of like make more sort of sales through that. There's other things that maybe get out of the sort of pure realm of marketing. There's a lot of times that people find that they look for, they look at things with a sustainability lens and they end up like cutting down on their packaging. And that actually saves them money. There's lots of things that actually can save you money when you do that. There's other things, I'll go further. Sort of like your employees. Even if your customers don't care, your employees might do. Even if you're a decent sized firm, you might be able to attract better talent if you're more sustainable. So there's a whole ton of different ways that sustainable marketing can pay off. Now, that's one of the challenges, honestly, because if it was like one simple thing, do this, you'll save this money here, or you'll make this money here, that would be really nice. But a lot of the times, there's a lot of different things going on. And so one of the challenges is actually sort of finding all those. Accounting is pretty appalling at doing that. So as marketers, we kind of actually probably have to do a lot of that work ourselves. And that's kind of where one of the ways that MASB fits in. I want to get back to It's a Wonderful Life because, I think sustainability is what most stakeholders expect. So I've got some, toy surveys of consumers. And honestly, ask them, do they want a shareholder primacy type system, i.e., the companies just run for the benefits of the shareholders, or do they want companies to care more broadly about stakeholders in general? And unsurprisingly, partly because customers are a stakeholder, they want you to care about them. They want you to care about the employees. They want you to care about the communities. And so this is a business potential. Because if people care, whether it be the consumers, the employees, local government, other types of stakeholders, if they actually care how you're behaving and reward you for behaving better, then this is a sort of way that a business can, actually achieve something that a business that kind of cared less and was kind of focused solely on the profits of the shareholders would be worse at. So if that makes sense, you can actually be more successful financially by worrying about other people. But why has this got, what's still, we want to tie this back to MASB in particular. And as we started talking about there with the question from, was it Scott? What MASB, is involved in is the accountability side. And so this is the reason why it's kind of a key thing for MASB. Accountability is a really key part of sustainability. A lot of the times, a lot of the sort of problems or some of the cynicism around sustainability might come from the fact that, you're not actually sure whether they are doing anything good. They might say they are, but are they? And so, how can we be accountable for that? How can, I've just said that you can make more money by being sustainable, but how do I show that? So these are the questions that we really need to grasp because you've got, like you say, you've got these benefits where you're hiring better people because you've got this more sustainable side to you, and better people want to come and work with you. As graduates, the graduates I work with, would much rather go and work for a company they felt was making a positive impression in the world. If that's the case, how do we start to understand the benefits of that? And honestly, it's super hard. A lot of the benefits come down to branding. And so this is one of the reasons why it's like a really sort of strong thing for MASB, because MASB's has a long history of understanding the value of brands and trying to sort of communicate that this is a really important thing. And sustainability is often its payback is through the value of the brands. It's the value of the brands that other companies want to work with. Is the value of the brands that the end consumer looks for. Kind of thing. I mean, a classic case. I'll get into other examples, but I love the example of Cadbury's from the 19th century. One of the reasons why that Quaker business did well was because people knew that they weren't willing to compromise on the safety of their customers to make money. That wasn't something that they were willing to do, and that gave the consumers trust, and it helped to build the Cadbury's brand to what it is today. So it's not some. This isn't some sort of idea that someone came up with a couple of years ago. I would say sustainable marketing has been with us for as long as marketing has. We've obviously called things differently, but that's kind of one of the things that I kind of want to emphasize. So let's go into some case studies then. Who knows Tony's Chocolonely? Tony's is a brand that's been really quite big in Europe, but I know now it's in my local Walmart. It's in my local Target. It's available on Amazon. It's available all sorts of online. They have a big presence in the US. It's I think I don't want to swear to this now, but the US is now their biggest market. Essentially, Tony's is a mission-driven company. So the original Tony is a Dutch journalist who was kind of worried about problems in the chocolate supply chain. And so what was he going to do? Well, he wanted to set up a way of sort of helping the people who are, harvesting the chocolate or the cocoa. So he kind of wanted to set up a company, but someone needed to buy from that company. Tony didn't have much money himself. He couldn't just give money to the people there. So he set up this company, And he really wanted it to be like a popular company, a good, a company that people actually wanted to buy from. And so he created this excellent chocolate. And so if you had Tony's, it's great chocolate. It's a very nice type of chocolate. It's a very 21st century. You've got a problem, you're addressing it. Anyhow, so Tony's set up this mission to basically improve its supply chain, which was to make sure that the people in the supply chain, that there wasn't forced labor, that there wasn't child labor, that the people who were doing the harvesting of the chocolate, the cocoa, were actually getting a decent wage, and could live off the monies. And so Tony's now produces regular reports on what's going on. And the great thing about Tony's is Tony's will even tell you when things are not going perfectly. So if you look to Tony's report, it will kind of admit that they had a problem, and that's one of the things that's important. You need to be willing to admit you've got a problem in order to address it. I would still say they've got a much smaller problem than some other places, but it's cool that they're willing to do that. We're saying that they've now opened their chain to other companies, and so Waitrose, the risk of going for another UK company. Waitrose is a big company that now a big sort of medium upmarket grocery store in the UK that uses Tony's open chain, and that basically means they use Tony's supply chain to verify that the people who are the cocoa farmers are actually being treated properly. I would say one of the things I kind of want to emphasize is just the way Tony's approached selling chocolate. If you kind of look at the bar there, it's fun, it's vibrant, it's exciting, it's good chocolate. So it wasn't, you can imagine when you're talking about sort of modern slavery in the supply chain, that's kind of not the funnest thing to talk about. But they didn't like go for a chocolate bar that had like pictures of people suffering on it and say, buy this chocolate bar, people are suffering, you need to alleviate the suffering. They made it like a fun chocolate thing that you could enjoy. You could enjoy, making people's lives better, and that's cool. Massive increase in the company, massive increase in their revenues, a very good gross margin. It's a very meaningful business, but it's also a successful business, and that's kind of one of the things that we want to emphasize. It's not charity. It's making money. It's a successful business. Anyhow, let's move on. I really wanted to go for an EV example, and EVs are really interesting. Clearly, it's controversial. Clearly, there's a lot going on in the EV world, and BYD. We can talk about this company, and everyone's probably aware of them. You know, big footprint now. They're now the biggest EV retail manufacturer by volume. When I was in Madrid a few days ago, lots of the taxis that went flying past were BYDs. It's a major problem they're addressing. So obviously greenhouse gases are a big problem that come from fossil fuels. But even if you're not a greenhouse gas person for whatever reason, air pollution, if you're in a city, I know when I grew up in London, when I used to work in London, I couldn't breathe. And it's kind of handy now to be able to breathe. I'm a big fan of breathing. Um, you know, Air pollution associated with ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars, have been estimated to kill, 246,000 people annually. That's a lot of people dying unnecessarily. Um, you know, and we'll get back to the perfect and the good when we talk about EVs. I think one of the things that sometimes people say is that EVs aren't perfect, and clearly they use greenhouse gases to produce them. They will produce greenhouse gases when making them, and They tend to make a little more greenhouse gases in production than internal combustion engine cars. So it's worth saying that nothing's perfect, but if you kind of drive them for a decent period of time, a couple of years, I did some calculations here. It's about a year in Georgia with our energy mix. That they pay back, so they're better over time. And so this kind of gets to a sort of a good idea in sustainability. And when we start thinking long term, it's really important. Things that matter in the long term, you know, can really help you, and that's how you can help the planet. One of the things I want to say about BYD particularly, and to a certain extent Chinese EVs, um, is they're determined to be affordable. And I think, obviously US EVs, there's some like really, high end cool EVs. Um, but to get them out, to do the maximum good, you kind of need to get normal people driving them. And so BYD is kind of, you know, with lots of support from the Chinese government, is helping drive that, which is an exciting process. I don't want to take this moment to kind of reinforce a point that I've been trying to make throughout. Sustainable business is for profit business. So you might think, we want to do well by the world. That sounds kind of a bit not for profit. It sounds a bit friendly. Um, but if a business isn't commercially viable, it can't have that lasting impact because it just can't last. And therefore, it isn't by definition sustainable. Um, so, when we say sustainable business, we mean commercially successful business that helps the world. We don't mean business that just gives away its money because it's really nice and then goes bankrupt in a couple of weeks. Commercially successful and sustainable business go together. That's kind of like you can't really be sustainable unless you're commercially successful as a business. Anyhow, one of the things again why MASB fits in so well here is because a lot of these things that benefit the sustainable business, the benefits to sustainable business, don't appear on the financial accounting statements. Just like most brands don't appear on the financial statements, accounting statements. So if you think MASB's long recognized the limitations of accounting profit, it's going to miss things like customer value, innovation, brand value, all these really important business things that are commercial things. They're not just like some sort of made up idea. This is central to the success of businesses. And they're being missed by the financial accounting statements. So MASB's in a unique position to help us see beyond that and to get onto this idea that we can be commercially successful while also being sustainable. Brand value is an obvious one. Customer lifetime value. If anyone's interested in my exciting book on customer lifetime value, feel free to read it. Not many people have. Um, um, and I think one of the things we can do as accountable marketers is drive conversations around the return to investments in sustainability. So what's the ROI of sustainability? Marketers, because a lot of the benefits are in brand, are in customers, we have a kind of a unique role in driving this. We've got some more on the next slide that should help. And this goes a little to Scott's point earlier. How could sustainability be commercially advantageous? Well, boosting retention. That makes sense. If a company, sees you're doing good in the world, if a customer sees you doing good in the world, that customer's more likely to want to stay with you. And the cool thing about that is you can actually you could do a delta on retention, and so you could get some sort of idea of how much that extra retention is worth. You've got to smooth relations with local communities. This might cut legal, regulatory costs. If you need planning permission, then that's more likely to come if you've got a community that actually likes you. Gives access to partnerships. I talked about this earlier. An example I always like to give is, the brownies that go into Graceland's brownies that go into Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's weren't just looking for any other company. They used a relatively modest sized US bakery, New York bakery. And the reason why they used it, I'm assuming, is because it had like a social mission, an open hiring policy, a way to particularly help people with mistakes in their past get back into the workplace. Employees like it. Talked a little bit about scope of emissions earlier. In greenhouse gases, we have scope 1, which is kind of your emissions, scope 2, which is the energy that you buy emissions, and then scope 3, which is emissions across the supply chain. Now, scope 3 is kind of obviously hard to get your head round and hard to monitor. But if you're supplying anything to a large multinational company, particularly one operating in Europe or California or New York, then you're going to want to cut down on your emissions to ensure that you don't mess up their scope 3 emissions. So that's vital. They will be looking for companies that have lower emissions, and so that can be something that if you lower your emissions, you can get extra contracts through that. Often brings savings from efficiencies that are noticeable. There's lots of examples in the sustainability world of people noticing problems because they were thinking about sustainability, and they can even generate new resources. But think of things that might be thought of as trash, but are now thought of as inputs. That can happen too. Lots of things can happen. Great example. This is a brand finance example of an international NGO dedicated to tackling ocean plastic pollution. And so they wanted to see, what difference they were making. And so they wanted to quantify the impact and assess how much the association with the mission influences willingness to pay from the customers, look at the revenues and brand value, and understand the reputational risks and benefits. And that's another thing that perhaps I haven't emphasized as much so far, this kind of idea of risk, reputational risk. Doing something bad, you may get away with it for a while, but then someone might notice, and that really might hurt your business. If you can get ahead of it, then it cuts down on the risk of being attacked. Anyhow, Brand Finance did this assessment, and they found sort of big increases, sort of 8% in brand equity increases across 4 research markets, with major gains in the UK and US. So again, embracing sustainability can be commercially impactful. This is a bit of a classic. Frank's a big fan of this one. And this is particularly nice because, Walmart helped drive this technology. And Walmart, they're not, people don't necessarily think of them as a sort of cuddly company a lot of the time. But, they could help their consumers to embrace LEDs. And LEDs was just honestly a better technology. So the LED lights came in, that cut down on the consumers' bills. They gave them a new product for Walmart to sell. Walmart heavily promoted this. And it was kind of win-wins. You can see the environment gain because of the cut down on the energy. The consumer gained from cutting down on their costs. Walmart gained from selling a bunch of LEDs. There's a lot of benefits there. And so, if in this one, we talk about technological advancement, price drops, coordinated marketing produces one of the fastest technological transitions in consumer history. And that's some of the things we might see again, these price drops. You can see the prices of particularly things like batteries, the prices of, renewable energy has declined very, very considerably in the last few years. And so we can see these sort of benefits of getting to a point where, particularly in the case of renewable energy, and there's lots of complexities in the energy market, so don't, I'm not making light of this, but renewable energy can often be kind of much cheaper nowadays. What I want you to take from it is sustainable marketing accountability can help advance conversations around sustainability in business. I think marketers are in a really strong role to make a big difference to sustainability in marketing in business, partly because a lot of the things that affects brands, customers, that sort of thing, relationships, network relationships, these are often the heart of what marketers do. Sustainable marketing isn't a cost, it's an investment. So often things might be a little more expensive up front, but they pay off over time. If you get a new process that cuts down on your packaging, that can pay back over time, but it's probably going to cost a little bit to put that new process in. Think of it as an investment. A lot of these things, just like investments in brand, just general investments in brand, they look in accounts as they're an expense, but they're not an expense, they're an investment. In economic terms, they're an investment, and we need to think about them like that. I want to say that sustainable marketing isn't charity, though. The reward for sustainable marketing isn't only in the next life, and it shouldn't only be in the next life. We want it to be now. We want people to be doing the right thing and making money doing the right thing. So we want to encourage that, and I think it's very possible, as for some of the reasons outlined a second ago. Sustainable marketing, shouldn't necessarily be. It's a strategy for long-term commercial success. It's about the delivery of returns. Yes, those returns are fairer societies, better environment, but they're also commercial success. As I say, sustainable business, sustainable marketing should be a commercially successful business, or else it's not sustainable. Um, and the idea behind sustainable marketing accountability is we can show that things are actually making the world better and making the world better for the environment, for the people, and for the companies doing it as well. And that's vital. Wanted to sort of point you towards my website. So lots of stuff on my website. It's a very exciting website. I think it's the best website written by someone called Neil Bendle. It's really worth a look. I publish something every week, so do please go to that if you get a chance, and join me on LinkedIn. I've got a question now in the Q&A, which is: do you think regulations are a help or hindrance to sustainable marketing? Uh, I mean, partly with regulations is always like, what are they? Generally speaking, regulations have a positive role to do. If we have externalities and the regulations actually deal with the externalities correctly and efficiently, then that could be a good thing. When there's no regulation, that honestly gives you more opportunity to differentiate. Because if everyone's forced to do it, you can't really differentiate on that. But you can differentiate when you're being sort of better than other firms that aren't forced to do it. So broadly speaking, good regulation is good, and generally speaking, um, I think it's important that we have regulation. Um, it's not. I think it will depend on the specific case exactly. Obviously, a bad regulation isn't doing anyone any favors. So that's probably where I'd go with that.
Well, thank you, Neil. That was wonderful presentation. I think we should encourage everyone to go out and get the white paper and read the cases in much more depth than what we were able to present today.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
And feel free to reach out to me. As I say, read my stuff, connect with me on LinkedIn, just email me. I'm pretty easy to track down. So great. Thanks very much for all your time. Looking forward to the rest of the day.